Erev Shabbat Shalom Rabotai. We are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Megillah. We are up to Perek Aleph, Mishnah Gimel. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilun Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbayev, Deliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen, and Leavdil ben Chaim Lechaim, v'Refuah Shenemav, Denin Shalom ben Rosa, B'tor Shah Cholei Israel. The previous Mishnayot stated that the residents of large towns read the Megillah on the 14th of Adar, and the residents of villages may read it on the previous day of assembly, Monday or Thursday. This Mishnah begins by defining the difference between a large town and a village. Ezo hi ir gedola. What is a large town? Kol sheyesh ba 10 batlanim, any in which there are 10 idle men. Now this refers to 10 men who are paid by the community to refrain from working, so they can always be present in the synagogue at the time of prayer. Pachot mikan, if there is less than that number of idle men, areze kifar, it is a village. No matter how large a town is, if it does not have 10 idle men, it is treated as a mere village, and its residents may read the Megillah on the day of assembly before the 14th. Now we learned in Mishnah 2 that when the date for reading the Megillah falls on a Shabbat, it is read before that Shabbat. The law is different in the case of some other mitzvot that coincide with a Shabbat. It is regarding these days for reading the Megillah that the sages said that we do the mitzvah earlier and we do not do it later. Meaning, instead of reading the Megillah on Shabbat, we read it before Shabbat and not after. However, regarding the time of the wood offering of the Kohanim and the people, now certain families of Kohanim and Israelim brought wood for the altar on a particular day each year, and they obligated themselves to bring sacrificial offerings on that day. If that day fell on a Shabbat, they could not bring their offerings then, because only certain communal offerings may be brought on Shabbat, but not personal offerings such as these. And they could not bring them before Shabbat because the time for fulfilling their self-imposed obligation to bring the offerings would not have begun yet. Rather, they brought their offerings on Sunday. The Tisha B'Av, the fast of Tisha B'Av, the fast of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, commemorates the destruction of the first and second temples. If it falls on a Shabbat, a day when fasting is generally forbidden, it is observed on Sunday. Tisha B'Av is not observed before Shabbat because the sages tell us not to commemorate tragic events earlier than necessary. The other fasts that recall tragedies such as Shiva Asar B'Tammuz are also shifted from Shabbat to Sunday. If the fast of Estel falls on a Shabbat, it is held on the previous Thursday and not on Sunday. This fast may be observed early because it does not commemorate a tragedy. Rather, it recalls the pleas that the people made to Hashem to save them from their enemies. Furthermore, it cannot be postponed until Sunday because that Sunday would be Purim. And Yom Kippur was observed on Shabbat itself because the Torah instructs us to do so. Chagigah, the Chagigah offering, this refers to the Shalmei Chagigah festival peace offering, which every man was required to bring on the first day of Pesach, the first day of Sukkot, and on Shavuot. If he failed to bring it then, he could bring it on any of the following 6 days or 7 days in the case of Sukkot. Therefore, if the first day fell on a Shabbat, when personal offerings may not be brought, he would bring it on Sunday. V'akel, in the assembly, the Torah in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 31, verses 10 through 12, state that in the year after the Shemitah year, on the night following the first day of Sukkot, all the people must assemble in the temple courtyard to hear the king read the book of Deuteronomy, Dvarim. If that night was Shabbat, Friday night, the assembly was postponed until the next night. It could not take place on Shabbat because the Torah commands that the event be attended even by babies who are too young to walk. Since it is forbidden to carry them to a public domain on Shabbat, the assembly was postponed until the following night. So in all these cases, regarding the time of the wood offering of the Kohanim and the people, the fast of Tisha B'Av, the Chagigah offering and the assembly, the opposite is true. Me'acherin v'lo makdimin. We do it later and we do not do it earlier. Meaning, when the time for performing any of these mitzvot falls on a Shabbat, we do it after that Shabbat and not before. Now, when the Megillah is read before the 14th of Adar, the day of the reading is subject to these laws. Even though the sages said that we do the mitzvah of reading the Megillah earlier and we do not do it later, mutarin besped uftaniyot umatanot levyunim. On those earlier days when the Megillah is read, we are allowed to hold eulogies and fasts. Eulogies and fasts are permitted on the earlier dates because they are not considered festivals, and perform the mitzvah of giving gifts to the poor. People who read the Megillah on an earlier day can fulfill the mitzvah of giving gifts to the poor, matanet levunim, on that day, and they do not have to do so again on Purim itself. This mitzvah is associated with the reading of the Megillah because the poor expect to receive these gifts when the Megillah is read, as the Gemara explains on page 4b, Masechet Megillah. However, the Tosfot Yom Tov adds, one cannot fulfill the mitzvot of the Purim feast and giving food to a friend, Mishloach Manot, on the earlier day. Now, the permission to read the Megillah on the day of assembly before the 14th applies only to certain villages. As the Tana now explains, Amar Rabbi Yehuda said, Ematai, when does this permission apply to a village? Mekom shenichnasin b'sheni u'b'chamishi, it applies only to a place whose residents enter the town on Monday and Thursday. Aval makom she'en nichnasin lo b'sheni v'lo b'chamishi, but if it is a place whose residents do not enter the town on Monday or Thursday, and korin otah ela bismanad, they may not read the Megillah except in its proper time, the 14th of Adar. Now, villagers were given permission to read the Megillah on the Monday or Thursday before the 14th of Adar in order to spare them from having to make another trip to the town on the 14th. If they do not usually go to town on Monday and Thursday, in which case they would gain nothing by reading the Megillah, then there is no reason to permit them to do so. And that is that of Mishnah Gimel. Mishnah Daled continues, in a Hebrew leap year, when an extra month of Adar is added, Purim is celebrated in the second Adar. The Jewish months are based on a lunar system, meaning each month coincides with the revolution of the moon around the earth. 12 of these months form a standard lunar year. A lunar year is about 11 days shorter than a solar year, which is the time it takes for the earth to go around the sun. The difference between the lunar and solar year presents a problem with regard to the festivals. The festivals must fall on certain dates of the lunar months, yet they must also fall on particular seasons which are determined by the solar year. For example, Pesach, which starts on the 15th of the month of Nisan, must always occur in the spring. If no adjustment is made, the monthly dates of the festivals would gradually shift away from the required seasons. So to prevent this shift, an extra month is added to every second or third year, making it a leap year, so that the lunar and solar years become aligned more closely. Each year, a special court would decide whether to add a month to that year. Now, in Sanhedrin, Masechet Sanhedrin, page 11a and b, they discuss over there the factors that they were considered. But nowadays, the timing of the leap years is determined by a fixed calendar. The 13th month is added after Adar, and so it is called Adar Sheni, the second Adar. And the decision to add that month could be made at any time during the first Adar, even after Purim had passed, as the Mishnah says in Eduyot, chapter 7, Mishnah 7. So the Mishnah discusses what happens if people read the Megillah in the first Adar. Karut Megillah Badar Rishon, if they read the Megillah in the first Adar, V'nitabra Shana, and then an extra month of Adar was added to the year. Korin Otah Ba'adar Sheni, they must read it again in the second Adar. They did not fulfill their obligation by reading the Megillah in the first Adar, and they must read it again in the second Adar. Now nowadays, when we use a fixed calendar, the Mishnah's case cannot arise because it is known in advance which years are leap years and which one are not. Nevertheless, the Mishnah's law is relevant where people did not realize that it was a leap year and they mistakenly read the Megillah on the first Adar. They must repeat it again and they must read it again in the second Adar. And the Mishnah states a rule. And ben Adar Rishon Adar Hasheni, there is no difference between the 14th and 15th of the first Adar and the 14th and 15th of the second Adar, except for the mitzvot of reading the Megillah and giving gifts to the poor, which can be fulfilled only during the second Adar. Now the 14th and 15th of the two Adars are the same in that fasting and eulogies are prohibited on all 4 days. The only difference is for the mitzvot of reading the Megillah and giving gifts to the poor. One who performs these mitzvot in the first Adar has not fulfilled his obligation, and the same applies to the mitzvah of sending gifts of food and the Purim feast. And that is the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Everybody should have an Erev Shabbat Shalom and a Shana Tova, a Ketiva v'Chatima Tova. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'Amen.